Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, August 23rd, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Blinken has sentenced ceasefire talks to death. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken's comments about ceasefire talks this week sentenced the negotiations to death. This was reported by Middle East Eye, and they were citing Israeli media reports that used that language, saying that Blinken has sentenced the talks to death. And what they're referring to was the comments that he made on Monday after meeting with Netanyahu in Israel. Blinken came out and said Netanyahu's agreed to the U.S., what they're calling the bridging proposal. Now it's all up to Hamas to agree to a deal. But this U.S. proposal is essentially an Israeli proposal. It includes Netanyahu's demands. It just tries to placate Israel. And a lot of these, the main demands that are obstructing things, keeping Israeli troops in Gaza, controlling the border on Egypt and everything. The Israeli military doesn't think that those are necessary conditions for a deal, but Netanyahu is sticking to them. And we've seen reports all over citing Israeli, U.S., and Arab sources all saying that Netanyahu's demands are too hardline and will prevent a deal. So sources speaking to Ynet, the Israeli news site, slammed Blinken for making the comments that portrayed Hamas as the obstacle to the deal. A source said, quote, Blinken made a very serious foul here that indicates innocence, amateurism, and a lack of understanding, end quote. So the source added that Blinken's positive spin on the ceasefire negotiations was likely an effort to prevent the situation from overshadowing the Democratic National Convention. Wanted to put a positive light on this horrific slaughter that's happening in Gaza, acting like they are working for a ceasefire when in the reality it looks like it's not even close to happening. So this source said, quote, he broadcast optimism from intra-American political considerations so that the Democratic Convention in Chicago would go smoothly, but senior officials of the Israeli negotiating team who listened to his press conference wanted to dispel the speculations, end quote. The sources called Blinken's comment a gift to Netanyahu and said the Israeli leader's continued insistence that Israel must maintain control of the Gaza-Egypt border, known as the Philadelphia Corridor, will prevent a deal. One of the sources said, quote, there is no deal and there is no summit if the Israeli insistence on deploying forces along the Philadelphia axis continues. What was implied in Blinken's words is that the U.S. is giving Netanyahu support for IDF forces to remain in Philadelphia, while both the Egyptians refuse and Hamas refuses, end quote. So U.S. and Israeli officials are due to meet again in Cairo this week, and according to some reports I just saw on Thursday night, they are in Cairo and they're going to hold talks with Egyptian officials on the issue of the Philadelphia Corridor. There's other reports quoting U.S. Western officials saying that the ceasefire talks are dead, that there's no chances here of a deal happening, and it looks like it's not going to happen unless the U.S. decides to put real pressure on Israel. If they say, we're going to cut you off unless you make this deal, if they really use this huge leverage that they have over Israel, they can get a deal done, but it doesn't seem like they're willing to do that. And, these sources say, Blinken's being naive, that he's an amateur diplomat, but I think he could also just be purposely trying to placate Israel and just sabotage the chances of a ceasefire. All right, so the next one here, Democrats refuse to let Palestinian Americans speak at the DNC. The Democratic Party has refused to allow a Palestinian American to speak at the Democratic National Convention despite pressure from delegates. So the request for a Palestinian to speak at the DNC was made by members of the Uncommitted National Movement, and they represent hundreds of thousands of people who voted uncommitted in Democratic primaries to protest President Biden's support for the genocidal war in Gaza. Uncommitted delegates proposed several speakers, including Palestinian Americans, as well as Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan, and she volunteered at a hospital in Gaza. And they did hold an event on the sidelines of the DNC where these doctors, American doctors who were in Gaza, told their stories and said the things that they saw. And I mean, these are just horrific. They all say children are being purposely targeted. Children are being shot in the head. It's just, so horrific, these stories. So to have a doctor like that speak at the convention. Another person that they floated, I forget his name, but he's a Georgia state representative. And he published what his speech would have been, and it was pretty mild. I mean, he didn't really criticize the administration. He was just saying, people are being slaughtered and we got to stop it, and it was very mild. But no, they don't want anything to do with that at the DNC. They just want to cheer and have fun and be happy and excited for Kamala Harris. Don't want to confront the genocidal slaughter that she has been supporting as the vice president of the United States. So the leader of the uncommitted movement, Abbas Alawi, he said that the Democratic Party leadership said no to the speaking request. Uncommitted delegates staged a sit-in on Wednesday to protest the decision, and they were still pushing for a speaker for Thursday, which is the final day of the DNC, but it's Thursday night now, and I haven't seen anything about a Palestinian getting up there. So Ryan Grimm, who he's with Drop Site News now, he just left The Intercept, but I saw he's been reporting at the DNC, and he wrote on X that the DNC had told, quote, uncommitted delegates that no Palestinian will be allowed to speak from the stage, even with a vetted speech, end quote. So there were some, the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, who's an Israeli-American who's being held by Hamas in Gaza, being held hostage in Gaza. They spoke at the DNC on Wednesday, and that was supported by the uncommitted movement. They said, we support them speaking, but let's also get some Palestinians up there, and they were rejected. So, but these parents actually, they called for a ceasefire and hostage deal pretty strongly, stronger than I saw any of the Democratic politicians say it. It goes to show that you see the Israel defenders that always say, oh, if they just release the hostages, this would be over. But it's not about the hostages clearly anymore. It hasn't been for a while. Israel's been killing the hostages. So despite the pressure the Democratic Party is facing to alter policy toward Israel, its new platform makes an ironclad commitment to continue providing military aid to Israel, which I went over the other day. And you have Biden and Kamala Harris both claim that they're working for a ceasefire. AOC, in her big speech, she had the opportunity, if she really cared about Palestinians at all. I mean, she had the stage, and she just decided to lie and say that Kamala Harris is working tirelessly for a ceasefire, which is just a complete joke. I think Ilhan Omar kind of called her out for that. So the Democrats, the genocide Democrats, that's what we're calling them, I think. They there's just no reason to think that. I think a lot of these people, they've been saying, Harris isn't going to get our vote unless she commits to an arms embargo on Israel, which obviously that's not going to happen. But I think after this DNC, they're going to lose support from these people. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that will probably still vote for them. Even though, AOC is a perfect example. She has called what's happening in Gaza a genocide, and she's campaigning for the people who are helping commit that genocide. All right, the next one here. Ukraine used a U.S.-made GBU-39 bomb in Russia. So the Ukrainian Air Force said on Thursday that its forces used a U.S.-made GBU-39 small diameter bomb in a strike on a Russian platoon in Russia's Kursk Oblast. So this GBU-39 is a 250-pound bomb that's typically fired from a fighter jet, from aircraft. But the U.S. has also provided Ukraine with a land-based version that can be fired by the HIMARS rocket systems. That is known as the ground-launched small diameter bomb. I'm assuming because the Air Force announced this that it was fired by a plane. So there's not really much detail about this, but I think this is important to cover because U.S. weapons are being used inside Russia. You know, missiles and bombs striking Russian territory. It's just such a big escalation of this proxy war that I do not think is getting the attention that it deserves. And this comes a day after the Ukrainian Special Forces said that its soldiers were using the U.S.-provided HIMARS systems to destroy pontoon bridges and engineering equipment inside Kursk. And then we have the map here from South Front just to show that the fighting continues in Kursk, seems very heavy. Fighting also continues in the east, in the Donbass, where Russia is making gains. Just lots of people being killed all over the place in this war. You know, when it comes to the use of the U.S. weapons there, you have the U.S. kind of trying to, not really trying that hard to distance themselves from it, but they're saying, oh, we had no idea. You know, we weren't involved in the planning of this offensive, but they're letting Ukraine use these weapons. And I think this might be a strategy, kind of announcing that they're using these weapons inside Russia, because we saw Zelensky the other day say, oh, Russia's bluffing, you know, no need to worry about their red lines. Maybe this is them, you know, announcing the use of U.S. weapons is to say, see, look, Russia's not doing anything. You know, let us, you know, carry out long-range strikes. Let us use the ATACMS missiles to really hit deep inside Russian territory. And the U.S. is expected to announce a new weapons package for Ukraine on Friday amid the fighting in Kursk. U.S. officials told AP that it would be worth $125 million, and it will include munitions for the HIMARS systems, air defense missiles, artillery shells, javelin anti-tank weapons, and other types of equipment. So we'll probably see that announced on Friday sometime. All right, so the next one here, the EU's top diplomat wants long-range strikes inside Russia. So this is Josep Borrell. He's the EU's top foreign policy official. He's calling for Western countries that are providing weapons to Ukraine to lift restrictions to allow long-range strikes inside Russia with NATO weapons, which would be the next escalation. Another thing the U.S. is doing, I might have mentioned this, but when you see the press conferences about this, they say that what Ukraine is doing in Kursk with U.S. weapons is consistent with our policy, and they claim, oh, our policy hasn't changed. But that's not true. It was just a few months ago in May that Ukraine got the green light to use U.S. weapons just across the border in Russian border regions. And then a couple months later, we saw this big Ukrainian invasion. It was after they got that green light from the U.S. So the policy did change pretty recently, just a few months ago. I kind of get into some of the same things in this article, but just to read the quote from Borrell. He said, quote, Ukraine's Kursk offensive is a severe blow to Russian President Putin's narrative, lifting restrictions on the use of capabilities versus the Russian military involved in aggression against Ukraine in accordance with international law would have several important effects, end quote. And one of those effects that he claimed is that it would help peace efforts, that by letting Ukraine strike deep inside Russia, peace talks would happen more quickly. But we've seen Russia completely rule out the idea of holding talks with Ukraine in the wake of this Kursk offensive. And judging by their response, it seems like they're pretty serious about that, that they're not going to even think about talks until at least they get them out of there. And it seems like, that's going to take some time. So it seems like peace is much less likely now. And then I put in another quote here from Zelensky from a few days ago. about the drone attacks. This is just part of his, because we've seen Ukraine step up the drone attacks inside Russia. He said, quote, "Our Ukrainian drones work exactly as they should, but there are things that cannot be done with drones alone. Unfortunately, we need other weapons, missile weapons," end quote. All right, so the next one here, Ukrainian commanders blame poorly trained soldiers for losses. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So Ukrainian forces are losing territory along the eastern front lines in Ukraine, and Ukrainian military commanders say the reason for the losses is poorly trained soldiers, and they're saying many are even afraid to fire their weapons. Speaking with the Associated Press, a battalion commander in Ukraine's 47th Brigade said, quote, "Some people don't want to shoot. They see the enemy in the firing position in trenches, but don't open fire. This is why our men are dying. When they don't use the weapon, they are ineffective," end quote. And we've seen stories like this before, which, going back to the big counteroffensive that they launched last year, that was a total failure. There are these stories of recruits getting barely any training and not firing their weapons because they were afraid of the noise of their own gun being fired. I mean, that's how unprepared they were, just throwing people into the slaughter, into the meat grinder. So just interesting to see that they're still having the same problem. And I wonder if, they sent the more experienced troops into Kursk. So this is an officer. This is another quote that he gave to AP. Quote, "From the command point, I would like to issue orders to small infantry groups, but I am not sure if they are capable of executing these orders because they lack coordination and communication. Sometimes I want to shoot myself," end quote. So this commander is not having a good time. And just saying that the new, it's a common problem in war. The new recruits are scared, and that's a thing going back. You look at of people like not actually shooting the enemy, just like shooting over them or something, because their instinct just tells them not to shoot people. And again, just people brand new to this and not getting much training. All right, so the next one here, China says that it is gravely concerned by the new U.S. nuclear strategy. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry said Wednesday that it was gravely concerned over a report from the New York Times that said President Biden approved a new nuclear strategy that focuses on China for the first time. The strategy, with which Biden approved in March, also includes preparations for a simultaneous nuclear war with Russia, China, and North Korea, which is another first. So this is Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning. She said, quote, "China is gravely concerned over the report. As we have seen over the past few years, the U.S. has called China a nuclear threat and used it as a convenient pretext to shirk its obligation of nuclear disarmament, expand its own nuclear arsenal, and seek absolute strategic predominance," end quote. So current estimates put China's nuclear arsenal at around 500 warheads. As we talked about this the other day when I went over this story about the new nuclear strategy. The Pentagon is claiming that they are on track. They could have 1,500 by 2035. China has acknowledged that it's modernizing its nuclear arsenal, but it has denied U.S. claims that it's rapidly building up its stockpile. Mao said, quote, "The size of China's nuclear arsenal is by no means on the same level as the U.S. China follows a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons and a nuclear strategy that focuses on self-defense. We have no intention to engage in any form of arms race with other countries," end quote. And then I just get into the numbers here that the U.S. has 5,748 warheads. Russia has 5,580. 2,000 of the U.S. warheads are retired and going to be dismantled, and about 1,200 of the Russian warheads are retired and will be dismantled. And Mao called for the U.S. to work to dismantle more of its arsenal. She said, quote, "China urges the U.S. to fulfill its special and primary obligation of nuclear disarmament by further making drastic and substantive cuts to its nuclear arsenal, and stopping nuclear sharing, extended deterrence, expanding nuclear alliance, and other negative moves that undermine global and regional peace and stability, end quote. So, of course, China's not happy about this nuclear strategy that is focused on them. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. sends a Navy destroyer through the Taiwan Strait. A U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Ralph Johnson, sailed through the sensitive Taiwan Strait on Thursday, drawing protests from China. Senior Colonel Li Shi, the spokesman for the Chinese military's Eastern Theater Command, said air and sea assets were deployed to monitor the U.S. warship as it traveled through the strait. He said, quote, "The Eastern Theater Command remains on high alert and will resolutely safeguard national sovereignty and security, as well as regional peace and stability," end quote. So the U.S. always frames these transits as routine, even though Beijing views them as provocations. This is very close to China's coast, obviously, the Taiwan Strait, and tensions in the region have been especially high lately. So the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet, which is based in Japan, they put out a statement, again, calling it a routine transit. So the U.S., in recent years, the U.S. has usually sent a destroyer through the Taiwan Strait about, let's say, 10 times a year. Not quite monthly, but about, 10 times a year, I would say, is a fair estimate. This time, though, the last time the U.S. sent a warship through the Taiwan Strait was in May, which is a few months back. But the U.S. has been getting some of its allies to get in on these Taiwan Strait transits as well. And in July, a Canadian frigate made the trip. And China, in response, said that the Canadian frigate had, quote, "harassed and disrupted the situation and undermined peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait," end quote. I know Chinese and Canadian ships have done it together recently, and the U.S. has also sent the Coast Guard through the Taiwan Strait. I think one reason why they might be doing it a little less is because China's military activity has really increased around Taiwan in recent years, so maybe they don't want to risk getting in their way too much. But at the same time, they've also really ramped things up. The U.S. has really ramped things up in the South China Sea. So it doesn't seem like they're that worried about having confrontations with the Chinese military. All right, so the next one here, fewer Americans want troops to die for other countries. This article is from Responsible Statecraft by Aaron Sobzak. A July poll shows that a majority of the American public does not support sending U.S. troops to defend Taiwan or Ukraine, sentiment that lines up with findings from other recent surveys on these heated subjects, which suggests that Americans appear to be warming to restraint and non-interventionism in international affairs. Indeed, another poll conducted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs in February found that a majority of Americans, 56%, do not believe that the United States should pick a side in Israel's war on Gaza. And a more recent survey from the Council this month found that just 4 in 10 support the United States sending troops to defend Israel if attacked by its neighbors. Similarly, Americans' suspicion of foreign intervention were uncovered in a recent YouGov poll, which found that 79% said that they only support interventions if the U.S. were directly threatened, which sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? In the same study, the only recent war that a majority of Americans viewed as justified was World War II, which, I mean, that's saying a lot, because how many wars has the U.S. been involved in since then? And according to this survey, the majority of Americans only view World War II as justified. Despite these findings, Washington continues to push forward with fanning the flames of war around the world. So he gets into some more numbers here. This is a defense priorities poll that found just 22% of those surveyed support the U.S. defending Ukraine. 30% said they support America defending Taiwan, while 37% opposed and 33% were neutral. Additionally, a plurality of Americans surveyed, 44%, agreed that avoiding war with China is more important than Taiwan's autonomy. So some good, we got to get more Americans, thinking this way, thinking like non-interventionists, being against war, which I think it's kind of a natural instinct for people. I think it's definitely a natural instinct for people. It's just we're bombarded with so much propaganda that people can kind of get convinced or fooled into supporting interventions and supporting wars and supporting, what's happening in Gaza, just this total slaughter. All right, so the next one here, the last story, journalist arrested under UK anti-terror law. This article is by Brett Wilkins. So this is about Richard Medhurst. He's a Syrian-British independent journalist who defends Palestinians' right to resist Israeli apartheid, occupation, and other crimes. He said this week that he was recently arrested at London's Heathrow Airport and held for nearly 24 hours for allegedly running afoul of a highly controversial anti-terrorism law critics say is used to silence legitimate dissent. Medhurst, who is known for his work opposing U.S., British, and Israeli war crimes in the Middle East, and for advocacy for formerly imprisoned WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. That's right, he's a big Assange guy. He said on social media on Tuesday, quote, "I criticized the Terrorism Act before getting on the plane, then got arrested under the Terrorism Act upon landing. Can't make this up," end quote. So he actually just criticized this legislation. So he's saying that they actually arrested him, not just detained, under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act of 2000, and they accused him of allegedly expressing an opinion or belief that is supportive of a prescribed organization. They didn't say what that organization was. They didn't explain what that meant any further, apparently. So this is something, you see in the UK. I know Kit Clarenberg, who writes for The Grey Zone, and he's British, and he was kind of similar situation that he was detained when he arrived back in the UK. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. One from F. Andrew Wolf Jr., American Interventionist Foreign Policy, 1.25 century of failure. One from Representative John Duncan Jr., U.S. calls for ceasefire but keeps supporting war. One from Vijay Prashad, every place in Gaza, including schools, is a target. One from Omar Bartov, I was deeply disturbed by my return to Israel. And one from Kelly Vlahos, Trump really doesn't want to talk about Israel. And that was about this speech he recently gave that apparently was supposed to be some kind of foreign policy speech, but he didn't really say anything. He says kind of the same talking points about Israel, Ukraine, like, oh, this never would have happened if I was president. And then the line is with Ukraine, oh, I'm going to end it. I'm going to end this thing. He never really articulates how. And then what he says about Israel is, oh, they got to wrap this up. I'm going to give them what they need to finish it. They got to finish it, but they got to finish it quickly. So what does that mean? I mean, that seems like it has very bad implications, just let them totally wipe everybody out or something like that. So a good article from Kelly. So please go check all of that out. And also I want to remind everybody of the Liberty platform next Saturday, August 31st. It's the Ron Paul Institute event in Washington, D.C. I will be attending, and there will be great speakers, Dan McAdams, Ron Paul, John Mearsheimer, Judge Napolitano, other great speakers. Those are the ones that will probably be foreign policy heavy. Also, Jeff Deist will be there, Dr. Joseph Mercola, Gary Heaven, Joel Salatin, who I'm very excited to see. So it'll be fun. I'll be staying at the hotel. I'm speaking at the student conference the day before. All right, so that's everything. That's it for the week. If you want to support us, tell your friends about antiwar.com. Share, like, subscribe, comment. I appreciate everyone who does and everyone who watches or listens to this show. I hope everybody has a good weekend. I'll be back in a few days. Thanks for listening.